Over the past couple weeks, we've been talking about what it means to become the church and not just attend church. And if you've been with us through all these weeks, we've covered a lot of ground, right? Loving God, loving people, serving our community, every believer mobilized, sharing the greatest gift we've ever been given, walking across rooms, building friendships, listening to people's stories, taking a step of obedience, even if you don't know the outcome. And if you've been here, you've probably noticed something. I'm not really giving you techniques, right? This isn't about memorizing a perfect script. It's not about being a salesperson for Jesus or even being a salesperson for your church. This should be about something bigger. It should be about living life bigger, seeing people differently, seeing ourselves differently. Because Jesus never called us to be a people who just come together in a room and gather. Right? He called us to follow him. And that should change how we see things. That should change how we live. It should change our priorities. It should change how we define what success looks like. And so today I kind of want to zoom out, look more at the big picture, because eventually we all have to ask and answer the same question. Am I just reading about Jesus? Am I just studying Jesus? Or am I following him? Which brings me to an old Texas fishing story. So two guys are out on a boat in Texas. They're taking the morning to do some fun fishing, and they're back to back, and the first guy puts the bait on his hook and throws it out there, and he's watching the bobber out there on the waves, and he's getting ready to enjoy a nice, relaxing morning, and then boom! This huge explosion just off the side of the boat, and all these dead fish come to the surface. He turns and sees his buddy grabbing all the fish, putting them into a net, and before he can say something like what happened, he sees his friend light a stick of dynamite and throw it into the water, and then boom! Another big explosion. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouts. "Fishing," the guy replied. "Yeah, but you can't do that. That's illegal." His friend lit another stick of dynamite and threw it into the water and said, "You gonna talk or are you gonna fish?" Today I want to look at a fishing story, but not just any fishing story, the big picture fishing story. Luke 5 says, on one occasion while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen hadn't got out of them, and they were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little bit from land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. Now, it's probably been a couple of weeks since Jesus first met Peter. The Gospel of John tells us that Peter had been introduced to Jesus by his brother Andrew, and in the previous chapter of Luke, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. So maybe here, Peter kind of felt like he owed him one. And as I was reading this weekend, I realized something that, up until now, Peter has really been more of a part-timer. He knows Jesus, probably had spent some time with him, but Peter's relationship with Jesus is right now casual. It's uncommitted. He's kind of like, a laid-back churchgoer. And so Peter and his friends, they've been out fishing all night. Now they're on shore, they're cleaning their nets. It's been a rough night, they've worked hard, but they haven't caught anything. And then Jesus comes along and things get a little interesting. A crowd has gathered to hear Jesus speak. Jesus is preaching, and it's become obvious that the gathering multitude is there for him. And so in order for Jesus to speak properly, he feels like he could get a little bit more amplification if he gets out over the water. So Jesus gets into Peter's boat and says, "Hey, push out a little bit." And of course, Peter's more than happy to oblige. Verse 4 says, "And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, 'Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch.' And Simon answered, 'Master, we toiled all night and took nothing.'" So Jesus preaches, and then the crowds go home, and now it's about midday, and Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Hey, take your boat out into the deep water and let down your net." Now, there's all kinds of reasons Peter could have to not do this. I mean, one, Jesus is not a fisherman. He's a rock layer. He's a bricklayer. He's a carpenter by nature. And so, or you could say, well, you're just a rabbi, right? You don't know anything about fishing. I mean, you're a nice guy, but when it comes to fishing, Jesus should just leave that to Peter and his friends. Second, it's also the wrong time of day to fish. It's too hot. And besides, Peter and his friends, they're tired and they've already gone out fishing. They've already done this. They've already put their nets away. So the other interesting thing here, though, is that Peter does call Jesus rabbi. He uses the word epistasis, and it means teacher. It also means boss. So Peter doesn't make a big point out of this. He just says, look, I'm tired. I've been out all night. Nevertheless, all right, boss, because you asked me to, yeah, sure, I'll do it. Verse 5 says, but at your word I will let down the nets. And when he had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. Peter puts out to deep water, lets down his net, and he can hardly get it back up. There's so many fish in the net that it begins to break. And Peter calls in other boats to help. They can't handle the nets by themselves. And so between the two of them, they have problems because now the boats are nearly swamped with water, both of them. Peter and his friends are so astonished by the amount of fish that get hauled in here. Verse 8 says, but when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of the fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who are partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on you'll be catching men. And when they brought their nets and their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Can you imagine how elated that Peter, James, and John are now because of this just monstrous catch of fish? I mean, this is the mother lode, right? This is what you've always dreamed of. They've never had a catch like this. Their nets are bursting. Their boats are sinking. They had to call in reinforcements, and it still wasn't enough. And the result was, after that moment, they decided to leave their trade and follow Jesus. So they go from being people who are casually following Jesus to fishing with him, and then to studying under him, to working with him, to working alongside him. Which brings us back to our question. Are you going to talk or are you going to fish? Essentially, that's the question that Jesus puts on his future disciples. Because up until that moment, it's all been talk. Jesus calls them to action. Jesus challenges them to a different kind of fishing, something they've never experienced before. I mean, these guys are laughing and they're lifting the fish from the boat, and Jesus says, hey guys, you think that was something? You think that was awesome? That was a miracle? Or you think netting a bunch of slimy, smelly fish was fun? Hold that moment just for a second. I want you to think bigger. I want you to think big picture, okay? Instead of catching a few hundred fish, how about you and I go catch several thousand people? Jesus says, all those talents and all those gifts you have for fishing, I'm going to put them to use. Here, Jesus uses the word zogreo when he tells Peter that he's going to catch people. And zogreo comes from the Greek. The first part of that is zoe, Z-O-E. And zoe means life. So in effect, Jesus says that they're going to capture live people. Yesterday, Peter's job was to catch living fish. But ultimately, those fish die. But now Jesus would seek Peter out to catch people who are spiritually dead and introduce them to life. And I think Jesus is doing a lot more than just filling Peter's boat. He's changing Peter's vision. See, Peter thought life was all about filling boats. Jesus was showing him, no, it's really more about people. And honestly, I think we struggle with that same thing today. We think life is all about work. We think life is all about paying bills or promotions or schedules or getting our kids where they need to go. We look at our retirement account and our house projects. What are we going to do this weekend? We spend so much of our lives filling our calendar and chasing after goals and keeping all the plates spinning, and eventually we begin to think, well, that's it, that's life. But Jesus has a way of interrupting people and reminding them that there's something a lot bigger going on. I don't think at the end of any of our lives we are going to stand before God and say, Lord, I wish I had spent more of my life answering email. People matter. People matter. Relationships matter. Souls matter. And this question isn't just about fishermen, because really every single one of us, we are throwing our net somewhere, right? I mean, are you going to spend your life making a living, or are you going to spend your life making a difference? Are you living only for the things that fill your boat? Or are you going to live for what fills God's kingdom? Because Jesus is inviting Peter into something bigger. He's inviting him into a big picture. And the first thing we see is the priority is people. There's an old saying, give a man a fish and he will eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he will sit in a boat and drink beer. Listen, you are only a fisherman if you catch fish. There's a fine line between fishing and just collecting fishing rods and fishing equipment and studying fishing and learning about fishing and, reading fishing blogs or just sitting in a boat and drinking beer. So in that same respect, when we fish with Jesus, we are supposed to catch people. That means we make that a priority. We talk to them and we let them know who Jesus is. This is what so much of our series has been about, making people a priority. Taking walks across the room for people. Caring more about other people than ourselves. Having a sort of, radical inclusiveness for people, even if they look different, talk different, act different, vote different, and so on and so on. So if Jesus calls you and says, will you choose a bigger vision? Will you choose a bigger picture for your life? You either catch fish, which is what everybody expects you to do, which is probably what you're doing right now, or you become a fisher of men, a fisher of women. Jesus says in Matthew 5, let your light shine before others in such a way that they may see your good works and then glorify your Father who is in heaven. Our light is either going to shine on people and point them to God, or we keep our light for ourselves. And in essence, we deny our friends a relationship with God. We'll either fish for actual fish, or we'll just hang out in the boat and drink beer. In other words, people can come to know God because of how you shine. They'll see it in how you treat them. They'll see it in how you respond to them, because of how you embrace them, because of how you prioritize them. You know, we say something similar at Walden Church when we talk about our vision. We say we're here to love God and love people. And probably for a lot of Christians, they forget, yes, that's why the church exists. As important as it is to worship God on Sunday morning and to go to Sunday school and to go to Bible study, we forget that our primary objective is to shine for the lost. We fall short often of what Jesus calls us to do. We forget that we're supposed to be fishers of people, not keepers of the aquarium. Not that keeping the aquarium is a bad idea. Of course, we should be upkeeping and maintaining the aquarium, of course. But that's secondary to catching the fish that go in the aquarium to begin with. That means our primary objective is to try to win people for Christ, to seriously commit ourselves to bringing people to Jesus. Otherwise, we're just talking about fishing and not fishing. Second, we need to see what Jesus sees. You know, it didn't matter to Jesus that his soon-to-be disciples were young men, unpolished, rough around the edges. And the whole reason they are fishermen is because they weren't previously chosen by a rabbi to be a disciple. You know, back then it was the hope of every teenage boy to be chosen. But see, only the best and brightest are chosen. So if you end up as a tradesman or you end up working alongside your dad, it was because the better and the smarter students were chosen and not you. But Jesus sees what these guys could be once they're given a chance at a big picture life. And that's what we have to do. We have to look past any selfishness in us to see the potential in others. You know, to see the potential in someone else for righteousness, to see the potential in someone else for kingdom building. Jesus didn't have a list of qualifiers about, you know, who he spoke with or who he healed or who got his attention and who didn't. The Bible says it was God's desire that all people would come to him. And I think it's interesting that Jesus, he doesn't begin with crowds. You know, he starts with a few ordinary fishermen in a boat, then that few became 12, and then 12 became 70, and 70 became thousands. Why? Because Jesus saw what they could become, not just what they were or who they were at the moment. And if Jesus can look at, you know, rough and tumble fishermen and see disciples, then we can't shut the door on somebody simply because of who they are right now. You know, last week we talked about, last time we were together, we talked about that we have a before and after to our story, right? That there's a before, you know, who we were before we met Jesus. Yeah. How far off track is your before story? How ugly were you? How selfish were you in your before story? And what was it that Christ had to look past in order to see you and embrace you and give you grace? Because I guarantee you, he looks past something in all of us. He sees potential in all of us. And, you know, Peter is such an interesting character in the Bible as a role model or as a hero. Success is not Peter's legacy. I think obedience is. You know, Jesus only asked Peter to lower his net, and then Jesus did all the work. Because the thing about introducing someone to Jesus, or even just, inviting them to church, is that Jesus is only interested in our obedience. He's not commanding us to succeed. 1 Samuel 15 says, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. When Peter puts down his net into deep water, he'd already been fishing all night long, and he hadn't caught anything, so he's not expecting to catch anything. His hopes are not high. But because Jesus asked him to, he lowered his net in the water. You see that? See, up until this point, Peter is a tired fisherman, been out all night, failed. But Jesus sees potential in Peter for something more. Jesus saw something great in Peter. And because Peter trusted, because Peter obeys, right? Jesus blessed Peter, and the result of that was so big that it could only have been from God. Last thing. Start small, but start. There's another old fisherman saying, fish or cut bait. Something happened that day to Peter, and it changed him. There was something about this specific experience that turns him from a casual acquaintance of Jesus to being a disciple. What was it? What dramatically alters their relationship? Was it Andrew's first introduction to Jesus? No, because after that, Peter is still a casual follower. Was it that Jesus healed his mother-in-law? No, we don't see any evidence of that either. That incident didn't motivate him. What changed Peter's life? It was when he decided to obey Jesus. It was when he knew what Jesus wanted him to do, and he did it. Granted, he did it unwillingly, right? It didn't make any sense. In fact, it defied all common logic. You can almost kind of hear him sigh as he says, "But at your word, I will let down the nets." And Peter's life is changed in an instant because he obeyed. It didn't make any sense, but he obeyed. And Jesus rewarded him big time. There's an old hymn. The lyrics are, "Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey." But something even more significant happens than that. Something more significant, that Peter obeyed Jesus and catching a large load of fish. No, the amazing thing that changed was the relationship between he and Jesus. You see, up until this time, having a net full of fish, that's Peter's only life goal. That's how he measured happiness. That is how he knew that he was a success. His whole life is centered around his boat and his time on the water. But now he's got it. He's got it all. He's got a net full of fish, and he realizes, this isn't enough to make me happy. He and his friends pull in the largest haul of fish they'd ever seen in their entire lives. And instead, Peter falls down at Jesus' feet, leaves his nets, and he follows Jesus forever. Why? Because it was in that moment that he realizes how empty his life had been before. He declares himself to be a sinner because he realizes how wasted his life has been. And he realizes how empty it's going to continue to be unless he follows Jesus. Jesus would later say to Peter in Matthew 16, "On this rock I will build my church." Peter became a huge figure in the Christian church, didn't he? Because Peter decided at that moment that he can't live without Jesus in his life. He decided that his life would lack all meaning if Jesus weren't the center of everything he did. And so he decided to go beyond just a casual relationship with Jesus as a rabbi to a life consumed with Jesus as his Lord. All because of one crucial decision. He obeyed. And once he obeyed, Jesus changed the relationship. We see earlier, Peter calls Jesus Rabbi. At the end of the story in verse 8, he calls him Lord. That's the noticeable difference between being a casual Christian and being a disciple. When you follow, you focus. A change happens in the relationship of a Christian, and Jesus takes on a whole new role. He stops becoming the wise teacher or the sage or the life coach, and the Christian begins to see Jesus as their everything. Jesus becomes essential. Jesus described himself as living water. He said that he was the bread of life. Water and bread are essential. Your life depends on them. So when you follow, when you obey, Jesus stops being this add-on to your life, and he becomes your life. And so the question for you this morning, what have you decided? Are you going to fish or cut bait? Are you going to talk or are you going to fish? Where do we go? Because, these last couple of weeks, we've talked about a lot of things. Loving God, loving people, walking across rooms, building friendships, listening to stories, sharing our stories, taking leaps of faith. Yes, but it all comes down to following Jesus. That's the real question behind this whole thing. Is Jesus just somebody that you know about, read about, study about, or is he Lord? Because Peter started the story calling him rabbi, teacher, boss, but he ends up on his knees. Depart from me, Lord. Something changed. Jesus stopped being somebody Peter occasionally listened to and became someone Peter completely followed. And maybe your next step isn't huge. Maybe it's one prayer, one invitation, one meal with another person, one conversation, one walk across the room, one lowered net. When Jesus stops being an add-on to your life and he becomes your life, I promise you, nothing's ever going to be the same again. Let's pray. Father, today we ask you to disturb our comfort. Break us out of routines that have made us comfortable. Simply attending church while forgetting that you have called us to be the church. Open our eyes to the people all around us. The neighbor across the street, the coworker down the hall, the friend who is hurting, the family member who feels far away from you. Give us eyes to see people the way you see people. Give us courage where there is fear. Some of us are afraid of those awkward moments, and we're afraid of rejection, or afraid of saying the wrong thing, or afraid that we don't know enough. But you've never asked us to save anyone. You've only asked us to follow you, to lower the nets, and to trust the results. So put names on our hearts this week. Put faces in our minds. Interrupt our schedules. Interrupt our routines. Create divine appointments that we didn't plan for. Give us opportunities to invite someone to church, to open our home, to share a meal, to have a conversation, to encourage someone, to pray with someone, to walk across a room. Do not let Walden Church become a church where people gather. Make us the church that goes. Make us the church that loves deeply, serves joyfully, reaches intentionally. Help us become fishers of people. May this community know there is hope here, grace here, life here, because people here live out their faith. And when we hesitate, when we doubt, remind us that ordinary fishermen change the world because they said yes to you. Help us to say yes more this week. Amen. Hey, that's your reminder too. We are a church. We are here physically with people on Sunday in Montgomery. We are on Walden Road, right across the street from the fire station. We have 2 services, one at 9:30, one at 11. This is me inviting you. Come to church. Become a person who stops just listening and starts obeying. You need to be here to be encouraged. You need to be here to share your talents and gifts. You need to be here to serve. Not just serve the other people in the church, but to also serve your community so that you can do your part to grow the kingdom. I'm always here in the office from 9 o'clock to 3, Monday through Thursday. You don't need to make an appointment, just drop by. We'd love to talk to you, answer your questions, either tell you more about myself, the church, our vision, or how you can be a part of it. I love you guys. We'll see you next week.